in 1910. Then Hazrat Inayat returned to India in 26. And now, in addition to that, the commemoration of Noor Inayat, who was murdered that same day as a freedom fighter. So these are the three items we would discuss. We're very much hoping that we'll get in touch with Pizia to commemorate his aunt, Nurunissa. Meanwhile, maybe I could tell you some things about the departure of, well, the two departures actually, those of 1910 and 1926.
Papa?
Yeah?
Pizia is there.
Ah, very good. Pizia, very welcome indeed.
Shaikh al Mashaik, Chachab, greetings.
Very, very happy that you could make it at this moment. So we're very much looking forward to your further contribution. So let me just say a few things. I hope briefly. I never succeed in being brief, and I'll still try. And then after that, we're very much looking forward to your commemoration of Noor Inayat. So you see, the impress of a great personality throughout the ages has always given rise to a certain mythology. Before there was any clear history, before there were any clear biographical data, the admiration and the attachment of people to a certain great personality always created a number of associations, a number of anecdotes, an entire mythology around such a person. And even in our modern times, in this 20th century, the same thing happened in relation to Murshid Inayat Khan. Already started from the beginning, and for very long, it was said that Hazrat Inayat Khan left India on the 13th of September, and therefore that was a day of celebration. He's coming to the West to teach Sufism. Now, in the first place, that in itself is not quite correct. It was that he left his hometown in the state of Baroda on the 13th. So that already emphasized that link, that very personal link with his own residence in India, which he had, and which it was which he really left. That was his real Hazrat, more than indeed India itself. He also didn't leave Bombay on the 13th, but some day later, which still will have to be researched. Some research has been done in that respect, but not that very complete. So then, very long, the assumption has been that Murshid Inayat Khan, in fact, was encouraged or even commanded something by his own Murshid to go and spread Sufism in the West. That again is pious mythology, and so they sprung up a tradition when people used to say, well, you know, the 5th of July, Milad Day was the birthday of the messenger, and the 13th of September was the birthday of the message. Well, these are very nice poetical evocations, but they do not match the historical record. Because when Murshid Inayat Khan decided to go to America with his brother and cousin, that was the fulfillment of a very long aspiration they had had almost since childhood, certainly since their adult years, their adolescent years. They had this intention of going and coming to know the West, learning the West for itself. And of course, in those early days, we're speaking of the later 19th century, the West was still regarded not in those terms of colonialism and imperialism and all these ideological modes which came up somewhat later in that time, but very much as bringing the West, contributing to these two civilizations in which you already lived, the Indian and the Indo-Islamic one. In addition, the Western, what would be the Western contribution, the promising contribution of the West to that society and the culture in which they lived. So it was a very positive approach, which they had. And what Hazrat Inayat Khan really intended to do, and one finds that in the documentation, was to visit the West, to come to know this West, which they had heard so much about, but had not yet known personally, and as a kind of addition to that, to make known in the West what they regarded as the highest accomplishments of Indian art and culture being Indian classical music. They said, well, the West has brought us many beneficial things in the material sphere, but in the cultural sphere, they do not know what India has produced in the course of centuries. And above all, they do not know the greatest of all Indian arts, the arts ultimately deriving from the gods and from the great saints of the past, that art of music. And so for them already, the idea was that music was very close to the spiritual life, and that therefore, it, so to speak, anticipated the aesthetic contemplation anticipated on the meditation of mysticism. So these two things were so much interlinked with one another. Then, after Hazrat Inayat Khan had concluded his 3 years of tuition in Sufism in Hyderabad, after that, from 1907 till 1910, he traveled in India, and he traveled there as both a scholarly and a practical representative of classical Indian music. That is to say, he traveled everywhere, giving a lecture on Indian music and illustrating that lecture with his actual concert. So that was a kind of dual approach. And in his lectures, he would, of course, discuss the current position of music in India, the certain technicalities, certain prominent performers, etc. But he would also always refer to that link with spiritual life. That to him was a very important thing. But in the first place, one gets the impression that he adduced that spiritual dimension in order to emphasize the importance, so to speak, the divine relevance of classical Indian music. And so that was his general approach in India. And actually that was the approach which he proposed during his travels in the West to continue. On the one hand, they hoped to study the West in a general sense, to acquaint themselves with the Western world, and at the same time to study European music more closely. They knew quite a bit about it already because there was an orchestra in Baroda, but at the same time to study music more closely and see what there might be in Western music that could still be of benefit to Indian music. For instance, instruments. The violin had already been introduced in Southern Indian music. They thought in music, in notation, in musical theory, in musical form, all these things might have certain contributions for Indian music as well. And while studying that, at the same time, as I already said, they wanted to project Indian music, make known Indian music in the West in its classical shapes, the Southern Dravidian and the Northern Hindustani, in order to demonstrate that high development that Indian music had attained and which they felt was matchless in the entire world. Now there was another impulse which conditioned Hazrat Inayat Khan to travel through India with this representation of music in both its aesthetic and its spiritual aspects. That was his concern that the traditional centers of Indian culture, that is the Indian courts, the Maharaja's courts, were getting alienated from these Indian traditions. The more the English influence penetrated these courts, the more the interest of the younger generation of rulers focused on the English way of life, the British taste, Western customs, etc. And so he, and not only Hazrat Inayat Khan, but others as well, were very concerned that for so long these courts had been really the centers of Indian culture and civilization, that interest of the rulers would really run into a different direction. And so especially their sacred art of music would be endangered. So we see, for instance, Hazrat Inayat Khan then in 1910 resided in Calcutta. His father had told him, all right, you are traveling all the time, but please find one place where you remain stable for a certain length of time. So in 1990, he settled in Calcutta, which then was the great English the source of English information and knowledge of English settlement, etc. And so there, he certainly was exposed also to these influences brought by the British regime. In the state where they lived themselves, that is in Baroda, those influences were far less. Of course, there was contact with the British residents, etc. But there was not that strong impulse, that the kind of process of Anglicization which took place in Bengal and in particular in Calcutta. Now, one interesting point, which I have not yet been able to enter into in detail, and maybe it will not be very easy to acquire much about it, but it is worth keeping in mind when you read certain of his lectures, that certain of these influences were no doubt already absorbed by Murshid Inayat Khan, and certain ways and customs of the West he became more familiar with. A typical example you can find in the biography when Murshid traveled to Dhaka, which is an important Indian state in Bengal, and there he was intended to give a concert, but he said he would only give a concert on condition that that he would be allowed to give a speech, that he would address the crowd. There was a congregation of all the rulers of Bengal and different other places, a kind of frequent joint visit of many of these rulers together. And so then Inayat Khan said, all right, he would come and he would give a concert on condition that he first could give an address on music. And actually, he even refused the invitation to stay at the palace. He wanted to maintain his independence, and only his tabelchi, the person who accompanied him on the tablas, insisted that once they have an opportunity to stay at the palace, they should go. So he was dragged by his tabelchi to the palace to be a guest there anyway, but he had wanted to avoid that in order to maintain his independence. And then there, in Dhaka, certainly a young Professor Inayat Khan Pathan, as he then was, stood up and gave a lecture on Indian music, but telling all these rulers, kind of criticizing the rulers about their neglect of traditional Indian values, and above all, their neglect of that highest of all Indian forms of art, music. And therewith, a part of Indian culture, of Indian spiritual life, was being endangered by their negligence in fully focusing themselves on the Western influence of the British Empire. So we read between the lines, but it's very, very clear that his speech caused a certain shock among these assembled rulers. That was not the way they intended to get a kind of scholarly scolding about their cultural orientation. And apparently then he still gave a brief concert only, but then the meeting was finished. There were a few of these rulers who appreciated that. And above all, the ruler of Sylhet tried to, which is somewhere in Assam, who was tried to connect him to his court, to keep him there. And he said, look, India needs people like you. There are too few of those people who are able to unite our vision on the one side, accepting the new customs, the new standards of the West, and at the same time maintaining our own values. But of course, Hazrat Inayat didn't wish to be bound to any court any longer, and he had an opportunity of traveling to the West. So, you know, nowadays people are accustomed when they travel abroad to go alone. In that old Indian society, you did things together. So when Hazrat Inayat Khan had an opportunity of traveling to America, he just sent a telegram to his brother and his cousin in Baroda to be prepared within the next 10 days of next fortnight to be prepared to leave for America. Well, of course, they were very much involved, much more than Hazrat Inayat Khan himself, in their work in that state, in the city of Baroda. There were quite a few things they had to loosen themselves from, to free themselves from, to prepare, to etc., before they actually could attend to their call. But the fact that their eldest brother and their most revered, saintly brother Hazrat Inayat had called them, of course, that was unquestionable that they would follow what he said, whatever problems they had in kind of loosening themselves from their attachment, their obligations, their circumstances in that state itself. So that's the way. Then they left. And then, of course, their first arrival through Italy, they traveled to New York and they landed in California, where first, and that is then, I think, a pivotal moment in the history of Sufism, because there, Hazrat Inayat was invited to give a lecture in California in a Hindu temple there. The Vedanta Society had a Hindu temple. He was invited on a Sunday there to give a speech and a concert, which he happily did. And where the managers there, the people in charge of the temple, were so enthusiastic that they invited him to give a similar lecture again the week after. But then what happened? Then it was that he received a letter from a certain lady in California, that was later the famous Moshe Rabbi Martin, who wrote to him that she had heard with him with great interest and great enthusiasm, that she hoped, of course, to familiarize herself further with Indian music, which she found very estimable, but of course she had to learn more about it. But above all, what he said about the spiritual dimension, this linkage of music to mysticism, to Sufism, that was what she valued above all. Could she not become his pupil? So there you have Moshe Inayat, who, traveling to India, had occasional pupils for music. But suddenly, then he got it. It would not have surprised him at all if people had asked him, "Can I come and learn Indian music from you?" But on the contrary, here was somebody who was very qualified in many different spiritual traditions, who suddenly asked, "Could I not become a music in mysticism?" Now, there you have that quite spontaneous shift from music with an additional dimension of spiritual awareness to the reverse, the emphasis on precisely that spiritual dimension with music in a support role. Even so, that was a gradual transition, and we probably all know that at London, there it was that Moshe, when that Sufi order had been created, and he noticed that in England there still was very little interest in Indian music. Then you get a famous speech from him saying that he had to give up his music in order to focus fully on the teaching of Sufism. Very beautiful piece, but again, that meant that music didn't any longer play a kind of role in his cultivation of mysticism. Before that, of course, music had been par excellence the approach to the inner life. And that was because the idea was that the contemplation on beauty absorbs one, gives one. All of you know that if you like music, then you will all have had that experience. When you focus fully on the music you truly love, then you have a way of experiencing life independent, with the emphasis on your physical or even your mental existence recedes to the background, and you're fully focused with heart and soul, as they say, on that beauty which you absorb. And that doesn't mean that you are less, you live even more than you would normally only in your physical and psychological condition. So that was something which was strongly represented in that Indian concept of beauty. And so actually Hazrat Inayat emphasizing that concept of beauty in many different ways, you all know that, love, harmony, and beauty. But at the same time, that music was withdrawn from his, more or less, from his way of teaching Sufism in the Sufi order. But privately, he continued with music all the while. When he traveled with his veena, insisting that he should carry that veena himself. Other luggage could be carried by anybody, but no, he will be in charge of his vina himself. So all that was there. Now, I spoke of the mythology which developed around the person of Hazrat Inayat, because people always have a need when they meet something which they cannot immediately explain, to evoke certain models, certain ideas which chime in with their own, and which in that way create a kind of explanation of a phenomenon that they cannot really rationally experience, so, or explain. So then, of course, a number of people who became enthusiastic adherents of Sufism were the Theosophists. Now, these Theosophists had already been there in California, but there, the focus had remained very much on that which Hazrat Inayat had brought from India. And that in itself was a valuable and very interesting phase, because in a sense, Murshid Inayat, very far from having come to the West to spread Sufism, as the mythology later asserted, had to improvise. He was speaking about music and the connection of music with the life of the spirit. Then suddenly he was called on to teach that life of the spirit, that Sufism, in the first place. And so what did he do? He, those kind of methods, all that lore which he had been taught by his own Murshid in Hyderabad, that was what he then transmitted to, in particular, Rabbi Martin, who was very well schooled in many different ways, in different Western and Eastern forms of spiritual philosophy and religion, etc. So he, and the interesting thing is that we still have the earliest notes prepared for Murshid Martin, or maybe probably by Murshid Martin, of his earliest teaching. And there you see that that earliest teaching is wholly traditional in the sense of what he had learned from his Murshid in Hyderabad. And so how far in the later stages Murshid then developed out of these Indian traditions into that wholly new shape of Sufism, which he developed as he went along. So that in itself is an interesting development. However, still this combination of music and mysticism continued as he traveled to Europe. We find a letter, there's a letter of which Murshid writes when he was in New York, returned from California, and then he writes a letter to Rabbi Martin in California, who was in charge of his Sufi work there, as it had developed there very rapidly. Then, and he writes that now he has to return to India because India's music was threatened with downfall, and so he had to be there in order to do something about that. And actually, it had been their intention to travel through the West for 2 or 3 years and then to return with all the information and knowledge they had acquired there and continue their lives in India as it had been before, but with that additional dimension of their further knowledge. But then, of course, they traveled to Europe, still with music and mysticism very much in tandem, but together. In France, he had a great success with, in particular, his music. In Russia, he had a remarkable success with both music and mysticism. That was an extraordinary thing in 1913, 1914. In Russia, both these dimensions of his teaching gained great acknowledgement. And then you get that remarkable development. They were planning from Russia to return to India. The Russian authorities didn't allow them to travel through Central Asia, which in those days was a very contentious area. So they traveled back to France, where there was a Congress of Music, where they had been invited to attend anyway. So they returned to France, then due to the outbreak of the First World War, to England. And there then you find that, as I say, a certain preponderance of the teaching of Sufism, because in England that music, contrary to France, that Indian music was not something which his Western murids could really work. It was not a contribution to their meditative life. Then, in this theosophical context, with many of his leading followers in the London period were theosophists, and they began interpreting Hazrat Inayat's person and teaching in the way other theosophists had interpreted Krishnamurti as the so-called world teaching and the world teacher. And that gained an enormous vogue, not only in England, but also on the continent, in particular in Holland. That was a very marked tradition, because there also a number of leading theosophists became Sufi murids. So that interpretation became a very dominant one. And in the perspective of time, what we can see looking back on this is that this, of course, carried a certain risk of Sufism being interpreted as a kind of neo-religion. Well, that, of course, Sufism was mysticism, the vertical line of personal development, and not religion, the horizontal line of collective adherence, of collective belief. But, of course, in its presentation, Sufism was very often presented in this way in the theosophical framework. Personally, I think that far from that kind of claim of being a world messenger and presenting a world message and all that kind of theosophical thing, it is far more illuminating to think of Murshid as the guru surrounded by a circle of chelas, a Murshid surrounded by a circle of murids. And I also think that many of his lectures become much more understandable, where you can picture Murshid sitting there with his murids, a circle of murids around him, and there, in a very informal, familiar way, presenting very deep teachings. Because that was one thing, and maybe that was a typical difference between Indian spiritual life and the West. That in India, the surface of one's speeches, whatever one said, could be very playful. There was a kind of playful surface to what you think of the great epics of India, Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc. There was one playful surface to a very deep intention, to a very profound kind of search of spiritual experience. That, of course, in the West of the early 20th century was totally unknown. They were in the early 20th century, they were just emerging from the 19th, which is very ever heavier romanticism. The romantic current was still very strong. And of course, they imagined that anything which was holy, which was solemn, which was great, which was profound, had to be that from top to bottom. And if you were kind of, you had this playful surface, that could possibly not be anything serious. Now, that is the kind of thing which people have made often major mistakes, and very much of the enjoyment of Murshid teachings, of Murshid lectures, is lost, where you cannot identify this. And how strong the tendency was that everything was holy, which was sacred, was elevated, was high, had to be deeply serious from the very beginning, or it was not really credible. It could not really be, what it was supposed to be. So that kind of mood was so very strong that, and I must say, often it continues, because you see the result of this theosophical, neo-religious kind of approach, that messenger and message approach, was of course, something which, had carried all that solemn heaviness in it, and very often people failed to identify that kind of witticism, which is right under the surface of Murshid's words. And if you don't reckon with that, you miss a lot of enjoyment. But I must say, here in Holland, we have quite a lot of experience of people being very surprised that Murshid could possibly be witty, except for an obvious occasion. But very often he is so in a way which people do not so readily note. One could quote many examples of this, but unfortunately I have no time for that, of course. But just take it for me that that was really one of the things. And that's why I would say, if you can picture Murshid Inayat Khan as the Indian guru with his circle of chelas, with his circle of murids around him, speaking to them as, you know, an elder person to his beloved adherents, to his murids, as if they did his spiritual family, then you get a far better, more ready understanding of how he speaks and why he speaks. You know, then he takes up a theme, then he, of course, brings in a story, he brings in an anecdote, he brings in an association and all these different kind of things. Ultimately, maybe even the lecture might be a different one from the title under which it had been announced. So Murshid continued that kind of guru tradition throughout his years of success in the Western world. How then, you would naturally say, did that match with that, with the theosophical message and messenger, neo-religious kind of approach? Well, that has been analyzed. I don't know whether you have read the articles about it. Very often these kind of more analytical literature is not generally widespread, but it has been analyzed, and the conclusion has been that, you know, up till 1920 and the London days, Murshid Inayat Khan kind of really ridiculed, he made jokes of these theosophical interpretations. Then that leads to, in many different stages, to the Golden Square crisis of 1920, where you, if you know the biography, Murshid says in the most understatement, the best understatement you could possibly want. He says, differences among my loving murids caused the transfer of headquarters from London to Geneva. Well, that is a very short and very mild definition of quite the time that Murshid realized that he was onto something quite spontaneously, and as I said, quite unintended as from his Indian departure, that he was busy adding a dimension of mysticism in the world in which that mysticism had not been known. And so that was something very novel. And of course, he realized that he was so much involved by all his leading followers being of a theosophical mode, that in one way or another, he had to make a compromise. For that compromise, again, it was not a great difficulty for him. He simply had to go back to his earliest experience in Baroda as a professor of music at the Ganshala. Now, Murshid Inayat Khan and notably his grandfather, but many of his family, were great experts of the classical South Indian style, the so-called Carnatic style of the Dravidian India. And they took that and imported that in northern India. And so that had given them great fame. They became the leading musicians of India in those days. At the same time, his father was the great expert of the North Indian music. So they had everything in their hands. And, but having created that Ganshala by the help of the local ruler, they had created that School of Music, Ganshala in Baroda, which still exists, now the Faculty of Music and the Performing Arts in Baroda. Of course, they realized that they could not teach that highly demanding, highly involved classical music, which takes years to develop, to beginning students, to young students who came from where you had to teach very simple things. If you do not reach out to them at their level, they will never get any music at all. So there you get all these Ganshala publications by Maulana Bakhsh, by his family members, by Hazrat Inayat, Gita Ratnavali, etc., all books meant for students in their earliest stages of their study. So that was exactly the thing which then Murshid transferred to his pupils of the theosophical mode. Mind you, especially all these leading theosophists in the movement were people older than him, and very often also ladies, the women, and in Holland there happen to be men, but you had England, you have many ladies, elderly people. So how are you going to tell them, you know, something which you are not going to contradict them? You wouldn't do that as a younger person. And so even out of respect and out of regard for their ideals, you have to accommodate them. So you find in the course of Hazrat Inayat's work, you find his addresses to his theosophical followers, because like his pupils, students in India, you had to reach out to their level. You had to go to their level in order to make clear what you really intend to convey. And in the course of time, they will develop out of it. You can lead them on and on to further higher stages of comprehension, of capability, but you had to start there. So from that musical experience in his Ganshala, like in many other things in his teaching as well, he also took this approach for those of his many followers who were of this theosophical mold. There was that, of course, in time also involved a certain amount of rearrangement, the so-called exoteric or the message activities, where the kind of appanages of his theosophical followers, there they could go along with whatever they wished. Of course, then these they were very great people, immensely devoted to Murshid, immensely devoted to Sufi, never forget that. So, but then, of course, they would not say that, look, I have thought out something nice and Murshid approved of it. They say, no, Murshid has told me this, and so I have to do what Murshid does. That's, of course, a very natural thing. You find it in all public life. You'll always find that people who find out something always take the authority of a higher authority to justify what they have done. So that's a kind of natural kind of thing in the human mental makeup. So that was what happened. And only for Hazrat Inayat it was the central control which he held in the initiatic order and in the central organizational unit, which was in Geneva, that he maintained control for himself. And his exoteric activities simply left to his theosophical grandees to articulate it according to their particular. Of course, he collaborated with them, he gave speeches, he was invited to, so to speak, justify their inventions by filling them with his content. And if you look at that content, of course, then you can say, well, very fortunate that these activities were there, because they elicited from Murshid certain religious subjects, certain social subjects, which otherwise would not have been there. So that was indeed a great contribution of these great collaborators to the articulation of Sufism in many different ways. At the same time, you get a certain distinction between the course of mysticism as such and these further activities by the Theosophists. And now I can just have time to make a transition from the 13th September 1910 and everything which emerged from that, of course, in a very rapid, superficial way, to that 13th of September 1926, when Murshid decided to return to India. Now, for many years, I told you that he already said so to, he wrote so to Murshid Arabia in 1911 or 1911, sometime from that, but that he was going back to India. They said all the time they were going back to India, and they never did. For one reason or another, it never happened. Very fortunate for us all, because otherwise the great classical Suran Sufis would not have happened. So thank God for this constant postponement. Then something happened. As I said, these theosophical leaders were very close, deeply devoted to Murshid, very close to him, but always tried to kind of show him in their direction, in that message kind of direction. And then, as I say, first Murshid in London had resisted that, and then on the continent he began giving into that, giving all these lectures in this mold, etc. And in fact, to this day, you find in Murshid Inayat's literature a very clear distinction between that which interested his murids, mainly his theosophical murids, and what interested him, he himself, and those people who were really interested in mysticism. Now, one of those people, or maybe two of those people, who were very close, very devoted to Murshid, and urged, wanted so much to see that world teacher and that new religious kind of message, etc., in him. In 1925, they discovered that really Murshid was, of course, playing along with them out of respect, out of consideration, out of a teacher's concern for his pupils, but was not really heart and soul with them as they had hoped he would be. And then they thought they could remedy that by seeking to, exactly as what happened in London in the earlier time, to gain control of his, of his headquarters, of his central organization in Geneva. So that was their attempt to achieve, and remarkably enough, they found quite a bit of support among national societies, leaders of national societies who supported that view. And so there was the pressure on Murshid to transform those headquarters in a way they could feel they could exert that control, which would enable them to complete their aspiration with regard to Murshid Inayat Khan. Murshid Inayat Khan perceived that, and that was the one time that he used his veto, that he struck down all these intentions and propositions of his followers. But at the same time, he also said, well, in this case, if things go this way, I cannot no longer associate myself with it. And so in 1925, he intended to return to India. Then his younger brother, Mahbub Khan, you see him here behind me on the wall, implored him not to go to India, because everybody thought, of course, everybody was terrified if he goes to India, he'll never come back. Whatever he will withdraw from life, or he will whatever do, but he will not be seen here again. So everybody opposed that, but in that sense, Mahbub Khan had a kind of casting vote because he had a kind of influence over Murshid as well, in certain directions at least. And so he persuaded Murshid not to go to India. And so then Inayat Khan said, well, all right, because my brother insists so much, I won't go this year, I will postpone it by a year. But that year he went to America. Now, and so, of course, in 1926, and finally on the 26th, 1926, on the 30th, he really left after the big ceremonial, which was there, was a farewell ceremonial kind of, in 1926. After that, he left. Now, the extraordinary thing is, that of this story is that from the time that Murshid really firmly intended to return, 1925, 1926, and his lectures from America, there, some of the greatest lectures he ever held date precisely from this period. These lectures in which he tried to reroute Sufism on its focus on mystical achievement. You all know these lectures. Think of the lectures in volume 10 of the Yellow series, the Palant series, that is on lectures on mysticism. Then the lectures on in mental purification. Those are such unique lectures in the whole literature of mysticism that they are, if there's anything of classical works in Sufism created by Murshid, those really are the top of them, I think. So it's significant. When once he had that feeling that now it has been enough, and now it's time for me to return, and now I have to leave people for themselves to work out how they want to articulate my teachings, precisely in that period, under that kind of pressure, so to speak, he gave a whole series of his greatest lectures, which you don't find anywhere else. Think also of lectures like philosophy and mysticism, etc. So even that period of pressure, of that period of leave-taking, so to speak, 1925, 1926, was the period of his greatest achievements. That is one thing, which, especially with creative spirits, you will find very often. When there is a certain, that kind of impulse, direct them in a certain direction, then their work will be more fruitful than it had ever been before. So that was, as I said, the 1925 decision to return, this return in 1926. Both these hijrats, both of these leave-takings, had, of course, their problems, had their their sadness in them. At the same time, they prefigured on the one hand and again left with, on the other, this grandiose teaching, the unique teachings in the field of mysticism, of contemplative philosophy, and of way of life and Weltanschauung, that very rich treasure of Murshid was conditioned by these two traditional dates of the 13th of September. So these dates deserve, whatever the ingredients were which compose these days, and which, as I say, which I try to make clear, had sometimes very human factors intervening that with, let us say, the divine impulse of Hazrat Inayat spirit. At the same time, that combination of the two created something, a treasure house, which in itself is unique, and which, depending on the devotion and the capability of his followers through time, will stand in future as a unique contribution of Sufism, to Sufism and to mysticism in a more general sense. So that, I think, is about, very briefly and very superficially, what I tried to characterize for these two dates. Remember them in that sense also with joy. Of course, as I said, there have been many ways which the light and dark plays through this whole course of events like it does in every human life. But in summary, be grateful and therefore be joyous and celebrate these days. Now, of course, the next, the following, what you will hear now, what follows, what Mircea will do, is something which does not have that character of celebration in any kind of joyous sense, but yet a way of articulating that particular heroism of human life, of which his elder child, his elder daughter, Nurunnisa, has been such a great representative. If Sufism is about transcending the outer life, meaning the physical awareness, the ego, the mental life, and transcending not only that outward physical and psychological ego, but even in the depth, as Moshe teaches, in the depth of the mind there is that heart, which opens up not only to the outside world, but as well to the life of the soul. Then there you have a kind of opening up to life, a giving up the outward life to reach the life of divine reality. And that is, of course, motu qablanta motu, as they say in Sufism, die before that. Death, mostly that is figurative, but in some very great personalities, that will the course of their biographical lives. And if anybody deserves to be remembered for carrying that, because in fact, of course, Nurunnisa was inspired by that teaching of transcending the outward self, transcending the psychological self into a reality which goes beyond, but in which is the fulfillment of the human being in the dimension of his divine selfhood. That she realized in a way which will remain unique. And so now we can hear more about that from Mircea, whom we very heartily welcome here. He has an extremely busy schedule these days, and still he found time to tell us more about this third element of commemoration on this 13th of September.
Thank you so much, Shaikh al Mashaik, Chacha Abba. You can hear me well, actually.
I do, yes. I want to see you also.
Well. Yes. Yes, well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be with you and to be with all of these friends on this extremely special day. We are fortunate indeed on this special day to receive your blessings and your elucidations on the life and teachings of Hazrat Pir Murshid Inayat Khan. as you say, today is Hijrat Day, meaning the day of leave-taking, and you've spoken so eloquently about the going forth of Murshid and his brothers and all of the reasons for it and all that Murshid found when he crossed the sea and how he responded to the circumstances before him. And you've led us right up to the point at which we reach another leave-taking, his return to India and the effect of that departure on his family, his murids, and especially on Pirzadi Shahida Noor, an effect that would in many ways shape her life. So Hijrat Day, as you say, is the day of leave-taking, and that is a subject that opens up into a wide field of meaning. What is hijra? What is hijra? It means emigration, it means departure, it means leave-taking, it means going forth. It also means separation. And there's so many ghazals in Farsi and Urdu that plumb the depths of the state of separation from the beloved. That is the theme of the Masnavi Matnavi of Maulana Rumi, which describes the uprooting of the reed from the reed bed and the great distance that it falls into, distance from its source, and the longing that fills that distance. And some Sufis have gone so far as to say that yes, it's true that separation is the great tragedy of our lives, and yet, paradoxically, it's in this tragedy that there is the greatest fulfillment. And so Sheikh Muhammad Chishti said, in fact, separation is a higher state than union. Because in separation there is love, there is anticipation, whereas in union there is no space for that longing. All collapses into singularity. So some of the Sufis find in separation a still higher state than union, and strangely, among the poets, among the mystics, there is in the depths of separation an uncanny intimation of union, and at the same time, in the heights of union, the crisis of separation looms large. So the opposites are in each other, and this is conveyed in the Gita Govinda, in which Radha, at the very moment of union with Krishna, in his very embrace, she calls out, in this very union now I feel far away and separate. But conversely, in the very depths of going forth, of emigration, of separation, we might find a strange union or a reunion. So Hijra raises these questions for the contemplative. What does it mean to depart? What are we departing from? What are we leaving? What becomes of that which we leave behind? And what are we going toward? All of these questions arise, and in Sufism, that leave-taking has another meaning, which is tark, which is renunciation. And renunciation itself is a subtle and complex subject in Sufism, because yes, in a simplistic understanding of renunciation, it means throwing away what is unworthy, throwing away the illusionary attachments of this world in order to discard what is unimportant. That is one understanding of renunciation, and there is that current in all mysticism, and it's very predominant in mysticism of India, which is the desire to get past this world of constant change and find salvation beyond change and beyond attachment, in that mukti, in that the freedom from involvement. And yet Murshid, in The Soul Whence and Whither, he points to this tendency, this desire for freedom, as only one of two primal impulses of the soul. One is the desire for freedom, but the other is the desire for joy. And he says the whole tragedy of life consists in the opposition between these two impulses. So on the one hand, renunciation can be seen as giving full vent to the soul's longing for freedom and detachment, to just rise above it all. But at the same time, the soul has another desire. It came to earth for a purpose, and involvement in the form of joyous participation in life is also an essential value. So how are these two dimensions of the soul's destiny to be reconciled? That is the great challenge of Murshid's life work, and that is the challenge that Noor was grappling with when her father left soon after Hijrat Day in 1926 and did not return again. There was a departure which signaled a renunciation. She could see that he was weary of the weight of all of the things that you so insightfully described for us. He was weary of it all. He was looking for freedom and peace. And she could see that he was like Ulysses. He was like Ulysses, who had just come back from across the sea. He had come back from America. Ulysses had come back from Troy, and was not to tarry long. He came, he contacted his family, but with a certain distance and with a certain presentiment that his further journey still lay ahead. And those were precious moments of temporary reunion, but already ominous with what the separation that was to come. And those moments are so exquisitely portrayed in her Eid of the Ocean and Land, which we'll have a chance to watch tomorrow. I hope that many of you will be able to join. Tarana, who is here, has been organizing it. And in the encounter between Telemachus and Ulysses, there in Ithaca, you can see the exchange between Noor and her father, and how he blesses her. He sees that it isn't yet her time in life to renounce the world. She must have a full life, a life of love and achievement, whereas his own situation is a different one, and he must go. He cannot stay, just as Murshid could not stay at Fazl Manzil. He had to go on. And so Murshid left for India, and then at last, months later, the news came that he had left this world, and the family went after some months and visited the place of his final repose, and Noor was remembered to have said, he isn't here. And also Noor's mother, when the family was staying in Baroda, heard a voice in the street, and she said, that's Murshid children, go down to him. And they went down and didn't find Murshid there. But there was in Amina Begum, there was in Noor this feeling that Murshid lived on in some mysterious way and could still be discovered. There was still the chance for a reunion. And whether they envisioned that reunion in this world or in the hereafter ultimately doesn't matter. It was a reunion. And ultimately life is one life, in this world and the next. There's a continuum of themes. As Murshid says in The Soul Whence and Whither, whatever is not resolved in this physical world will find its fulfillment in the next world. So ultimately it wasn't an important question whether that would happen on earth or beyond. But the aid of the ocean and land anticipates it, and in this way anticipates something, you might say, beyond the third renunciation. In classical Sufism there are 4 renunciations. Tarke dunya, renunciation of the world. Tarke akhira, renunciation of the hereafter. Tarke mola, renunciation of the God ideal, renunciation of the concept of God and merging into nameless being. And then finally tarke tark, renunciation of renunciation itself. And that's what aid of the ocean and land is pointing to, the renunciation of renunciation itself, which is a paradoxical subject, and which Murshid treats only obliquely in his teachings, but it's there. And you find it there by implication, because so often in his teachings he speaks of 4 stages. So there are the 4 stages in the inner school: concentration, contemplation, meditation, which is total renunciation of self, total mystical relaxation and abstraction, fana. But then finally realization. And realization reanimates the senses and one's participation in the fullness of life after fana. So realization is baqa. You have these 4 stages. But then when Murshid speaks specifically about renunciation in moral culture, then there are 3 stages. There's reciprocity, which is Sharia, that is to say harmonizing with the world. Then there is tariqah, or beneficence, which is going beyond mere reciprocity and give and take, but expanding into generosity and self-giving. And then thirdly, renunciation, which is a total dissolution of self. But in Murshid's teaching, I've found that whenever you find 3 stages mentioned, there's always a hidden fourth. 4 is the magic number in Murshid's teaching, and so one must be suspicious whenever 3 are mentioned. There's always a 4th one that, in that occasion, it wasn't the time to bring it out. But after fana, there must be baqa, and after renunciation, there must be tarki tark, there must be the renunciation of renunciation. And what is that renunciation of renunciation? It's hard to talk about because words tend only to reify something that is so mysterious and really undefinable. But it must be what my father used to call the reconciliation of the irreconciliables, or that the soul's longing for freedom and the soul's longing for joy are somehow integrated. And that is what Aid of the Ocean and Land is all about, because it doesn't end with Ulysses' departure to the wilderness. He speaks of going out into the wilderness alone. He will be alone in the wilderness. He represents in the play the movement toward transcendence, whereas Telemachus in the play, Nur, represents immanence and fulfillment in this life, fulfillment in this world. And so Iulus goes off toward transcendence, but as that isn't the end. And Telemachus, together with his mother, Telemachus is Nur, her mother, we may say, goes to find Iulus. And it seems hopeless. It seems they won't find him. But at the very end, there is a reunion, and they venture into the wilderness, but now they venture into the wilderness together. So that is the reconciliation. It is, yes, to be disencumbered of all of the attachments of this world, all of the preoccupation with prestige and all of the trappings of worldly success. Letting go of all of that, but not letting go of love itself. So to be free, and yet to be totally alive to love and fellowship. And so the very end of Eid has the cast say, "Together far shall we roam." So all together now they'll roam into the hereafter, which reminds one of the old Sufi saying, "The journey to God has an end. The journey to God has an end." The journey to God, dissolution of oneself, discovery of the vast, boundless mystery and merging into it. But the journey in God has no end. And that is the journey that Iulus and Telemachus undertake in the wilderness. And so when I think of Nur's days in shackles in Forsheim, and her last night undergoing the most brutal treatment in Dachau, and then kneeling and saying the word liberté, what would have been her thoughts, what would have carried her through? Her father must have come to her, whom she had sought in Eid, and the promise of "Befool not, O night, the sun will shine." The thought that night, here is night, but this night is not perpetual. Beyond this lies the wilderness in which we will journey together forever. So let us remember Nur in this spirit, and let us venture to join her in the happy wilderness of love and freedom reconciled.
Thank you so much, Birzia, for this wonderfully inspiring talk you have given us, and all the wisdom you have transmitted to us with this splendid expose and the splendid memory of Nur Nissa. Thank you so very much indeed. So let us hope to meet again tonight, inshallah.
Yes, friends, please do come later in the day at 3 p.m. North American time, which is, I believe, 9 p.m. for many of you. And Shaikh al Mashaik will be the honored guest, together with Shrabani Basu, biographer of Noor, and there will be musical offerings which derive from Noor's own compositions, and so we will celebrate together that way. Actually, before the celebration itself, we'll also have a sama featuring Pandit Srinivas Reddy, and so there's so much to look forward to, and I hope that you will join in these happy proceedings. Goodbye for now. God bless. Khodafiz. Khodafiz.
Khodafiz, and thank you so very much again.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful time. Wonderful time. I don't think so. Wacht, हो गया या नहीं?
नहीं, होने पाएंगे। होलिया से।
कोई बात नहीं। होलिया को हम बोले क्या तो नहीं, इनके लिए थे आज।
Zal ik de meeting sluiten?
Yes, is er any vraag of iemand nog iets wil zeggen of toevoegen?
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anybody who would like to have to ask a question or
make a comment?
Something like that? And please then raise your hand in the participant area so that I can see who's raising their hand. Or just unmute yourself.
Has this been recorded?
Yes, it is.
Can it be sent to the participants?
Of course.
Well, it was marvelous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just wanted to say Urs Mubarak and Blessed Hijrat Day. It was just really beautiful to be together this morning and commemorate. Thank you so much, Shaikh al Mashaik and Haranisa Begum and everyone. Thank you. And Puzia.
Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Khodafiz and goodbye.
Madam.
Thank you.
Good to see you here. Happy to you joined us. All the best.
All the best.